Hello, welcome to PSR, People Speaking Rail. It always seems like it's fitting when we're talking about the Canadian railroads because that boxcar makes a locomotive we use in our graphic looks like it would be either Canadian National or Canadian Pacific. I'm Mike Baudendistel, head of Intermodal Solutions here, joined by Joanna Marsh, as always, editorial writer who follows the railroad industry. Joanna, how are you? You've written a lot of articles just so far this month. I think five or six or seven articles.
Yeah, which is funny because I was also on vacation last week, so I don't know. I don't know, like I don't know how that happened. Yeah, so it's been going pretty well. I was thinking, you were talking about sort of the how we're going to be talking about Canada, and I was thinking like how can we or how can I spruce up the anything I say with an A at the end or like an out and about,
Mhm.
but I
Mhm.
don't know. I have to remember to say A at the end, which is kind of tricky. So we'll see. A.
Yeah, it is kind of an odd situation. I mean, it was so basically for those who haven't been following this, there's a port workers strike in British Columbia. So you have the biggest port in Canada, which is the Port of Vancouver. It's really sort of the main port that at least the Canadian portion of the CPKC uses. It was really sort of their main port of entry, before the merger, and then it's also the biggest that Canadian National uses. Canadian National also uses some other ports in Eastern Canada and uses ports of Port of Prince Rupert. They're exclusive on, but really, it's kind of the main gateway, or at least the biggest gateway in and out of Canada for moving. There's a lot of the big bulk commodities outbound. Moving a lot of containers. Inbound, and now that work stoppage is in the sixth day, is clearly just going to go through some of the facts of the situation here. I mean, more than 99% of the union workers voted to strike in June. Discussions currently paused. The group that's arguing in favor of and I guess on behalf of the terminal operators, they wanted the mediation arbitration to sort of take place right away. The ILWU in Canada rejected that. And you have sort of a situation that's kind of at a standstill right now. And I just wanted to show a couple of sonar charts in here that are kind of interesting. We've had some questions from sonar customers of, is any of this showing up in the sonar data? Would say so if we want to bring some of these up. So we have first, this is the ocean booking volume index. So this is based on ocean bookings that are submitted to the ocean carrier. And what I'm looking at here is just the port of Seattle. Sort of one of the questions we got from a sonar customer was, are you seeing any diversions to other ports from exporters that are concerned about just not being able to get their stuff out of the port of Vancouver? And it does appear you see that big bump right at the end of June into July, that big surge in volume, for outbound shipments out of the port of Seattle. So that was interesting, and those would be containers. This is from a product that we call Container Atlas in Sonar. And then we have another one that shows outbound of Vancouver, another Sonar chart that shows a dip right at the end of last month into this month. You see, these are outbound booking volume booking index out of Vancouver, and so at least the shippers are concerned that it's not something that's going to be resolved right away. You do wonder if this was happening in Los Angeles, if they would just, the president would order everyone back to work. But kind of an interesting uh, situation there, and one that's potentially disruptive. Joanna, what have you read about the situation?
Yeah. So I'm kind of I've asked CPKC and CN, and we'll be writing a story about it soon about like how the work stoppages on the Canadian West Coast is affecting their operations. I've seen some other news reports from each rail carrier saying, obviously there's going to be, anytime that there is a work stoppage or a disruption on one end of supply chain, it's a supply chain, so it
Mhm.
goes along. It affects other actors as well. It's
Mhm.
there was a report, I think it was in CBC, saying that Canadian Pacific or CPKC has issued sort of temporary embargo, sort of keep network fluidity. I'm still trying to confirm that right now. And then, of course, you also have CN quoted in the Financial Post saying that, anytime you have these kinds of disruptions, it obviously, it takes weeks or months to bring things completely back to normal. And you can see that even though this is a work stoppage occurring at the ports. I mean, you can just even see like with strikes that have happened for a day or a week, on CN's lines or CPKC's lines historically. It takes several weeks to get everything back to normal. And so, to your point, it is interesting to it'll be interesting to see like how much diversion occurs, to the other sort of the U.S. West Coast ports, and of course, right now, you know, the uh, the activity at the ports hasn't been as active as it was perhaps maybe 2 years ago or year and a half ago. But yeah,
Mhm.
it'll be interesting to see like if LA or Long Beach or whatever will be seeing some kind of uptick.
Yeah, the time it takes to recover from disruptive events is one thing that has always sort of struck me about the rail industry, because you have so many different pieces of equipment, different crews that are in the wrong places, that it does take, a lot of times a number of weeks. It's kind of like when you had the polar vortex in Chicago. It took a long time to sort of fully recover from those type of things. And it's also worth pointing out, I mean, for any shippers that rely on the just imports coming from Canada. I mean, you look at sort of those two ports, and about 15% of the trade that comes through the port of Vancouver is for the U.S. Consumption. But then you look at Prince Rupert, and something like 2/3 of that import volume is for U.S. consumption centers. So it's not strictly a Canada problem. It really sort of has an impact on the U.S. as well. And then, sort of adding to that, we have UPS threatening a strike at the end of this month. And UPS has long been the largest intermodal customer, the largest intermodal shipper. Certainly, largest intermodal customer if you don't include the domestic truckload-based companies like JB Hunt and Hub Group. And they use a combination of trailer on flat car and container on flat car. Have an intermodal, domestic intermodal containerized, graph sort of shows how the volume's going to be kind of flattish in the second quarter from the first quarter, but still down like 5% year over year. So there's still a lot of capacity there in the domestic intermodal space, and it would be something where you've seen weak intermodal volumes all year long, and this would just be one other thing that impairs intermodal volumes, further. And Mark Solomon's been covering the story closely for FreightWaves, and the Teamsters are talking about this as basically being an inevitable shutdown, and this would be the largest largest single company strike, I guess, if you exclude any sort of multi-company agreements. So UPS moves about one out of every four packages. Every another interesting stat I saw is every intermodal container on Union Pacific that UPS is using could be up to 2,000 packages in it. So really, sort of a massive disruptive event potentially for intermodal as well.
Yeah, yeah. Well, it's kind of a little bit related to that. My personal emails. I was trying to order. I got a website, or I got an email from a website, kind of selling books, and I was going to buy my 10-year-old a book, and it was interesting because it said you should buy your stuff now in July because in August there might be a strike. So, which I thought was kind of interesting that they put that in that email. So, you can go get your stuff now. Yeah,
Yeah,
but
yeah, get it
yeah,
now. We'll have a freight boom for the next 3 weeks.
yeah.
Yeah, I want to move on to some of the stories you've written about, which there's been a lot of them. I don't think we have time to go through all of them, but let's maybe just go through a couple here. I mean, Ohio is now pressing President Biden to call this basically a disaster area in East Palestine. Seems maybe a little late for that. So, what is state of Ohio asking for, and how would that help them?
Yeah, sure. So I think the Ohio was actually given an earlier deadline to for to ask for disaster relief, but for some reason they had pushed that back and asked for an extension. And so so you get this letter that Ohio Governor Mike DeWine sent to President Joe Biden the other day, asking I think for for help for to help uh it kind of again kind of boils down to cost. I mean, because initially, immediately following after, you know initially after the derailment of February 3rd of the Norfolk Southern train, you had all these questions about remediation costs and who's going to pay for those. And of course, Norfolk Southern has pledged um, to to uh, to help pay for them. And I believe, and I'm correct. Excuse me if I'm not remembering this correctly, but I think also the Environmental Protection Agency, or at least one of the federal agencies, had also, wanted to ensure that NS was going to pay for remediation costs. So you have that aspect, but then the letter that Governor DeWine sent to Biden was, well, what happens, years later, because no one is, his argument was that DeWine's argument was that no one's um, uh, really sure yet, what's going to happen several years down the road in terms of like health impacts, if anything. And so I think it's just that kind of assurance that um, that someone who will be around to keep track of things and sort of help things help pay for cost if there are some sort of long term uh, um,
Hmm.
implications that arise. It was interesting because DeWine said that Norfolk Southern is has committed to the region, but at the same time, who's to say what's going to happen in the future? If new management comes in one day eventually and decides to change course in at a NS in terms of how to respond. Um, so that's what's so that's what's going on in that, and so we'll see how that goes.
Yeah, and it seems like the tenure of the management teams at the Class One Railroad seems to have shortened in recent years. So it's certainly a possibility there's a different management team that says, well, that wasn't us that did it essentially. So I think that's interesting that they could potentially get federal assistance on top of the local and state. Then the other thing that was interesting in that article is you talked about how Norfolk Southern filed a complaint against the rail car owners in a district court. So essentially, this is a lawsuit. Am I understanding that right? And they name some of these big chemical companies in that lawsuit, and they name some of the big rail car leasing companies, GATX, Trinity, and then a handful of others. What can you tell us about that?
Yeah, so this lawsuit is folded into a larger lawsuit between Ohio and Norfolk Southern. Ohio had filed a suit against Norfolk Southern, over the cleanup cost, and so this recent action by NS is just, it's a complaint against chemical companies, as you mentioned. I think Dow Chemical, Oxyvinyl, which is subsidiary of Occident Petroleum, as well as some of the railcar lessors, as like Trinity and GATX. And, NS was arguing that, even though um, they're responsible for the track, and they ultimately the conditions of the rail cars, um, it's the rail car owners and the shippers who bear responsibility to ensure that the rail cars are functioning the way they should function, and that that they're uh, meeting current regulations in order to ship hazardous materials. And so it's interesting because I think you had mentioned earlier on, Mike, right after the um, the accident happened, that it's even though this happened on Norfolk Southern's track, that there are other parties involved in this, the rail car lessors, or potentially involved in this, like rail car lessors or the shippers. And so um, you have that argument starting to come more to the forefront, at least through this latest action by NS. And of
Mhm.
course, Trinity and GATX and SMBC, I think, or SBM. Forgive me if I'm not pronouncing, but using whatever. But they had mentioned that. Uh, that of course, that they're challenging uh, NS's claims. So again, we'll
Mhm.
also
Mhm.
see what happens there. But it is interesting how uh, so much attention has focused on NS when there are actually other actors involved, or
Yeah,
potentially
and that's
involved.
probably the reason why they're doing it. I mean, I don't know if they're actually going to get any money out of these companies from doing that. It might get something that's just dismissed, but it's just to sort of bring attention on the fact that they're not the only constituent that is involved in moving freight on railroad. There's a lot of other parties involved, and so to me, that's probably just kind of a PR move, if I had to
Hmm.
guess. And speaking of accidents, I mean, I just saw a news article from another site that said this today's a 10-year anniversary of the Loch Magantic.
Hmm.
It's amazing. It's been 10 years, but that was one of the worst tragedies in history of the railroad industry. But I think something like 47 people died. It sort of it basically just demolished that town. So it's one more thing. I think just people get reminded of that, and just adds to the greater focus on rail safety. But I want to shift from rail safety to service a little bit. You just put out an article on the Reliable Rail Service Act. So senators are reintroduce reasonable rail service bill. And so this is really kind of the thing is the common carrier obligation. The railroads, received all this land from the federal government in exchange for promising that they would provide what's called a common carrier obligation, which they would provide a reasonable service for those who want to use the railroad. But the reasonable what's reasonable has always been kind of a question. I mean, you had an article I think it was last week. I talked about it just when I did the show on my own, where this Navajo coal group that was trying to move coal on BNSF for export said they were not getting reasonable service and wanted STB to mandate certain service requirements, which they got what they requested for. But and then BNSF said, well, reasonable. What's reasonable in some situations is not reasonable in other situations if there's other sort of mitigating, kind of extenuating circumstances that prevent you from hitting delivery windows and those things. But what's happening with this rail service bill? What do you think will happen there?
Yeah. I mean, again, I mean, that's another interesting thing to see, what will happen. Because it was a bill that was reintroduced by Senator Tammy Baldwin of Wisconsin. And so it was introduced last October, but it didn't really get very far, even though have, rail shippers, uh, calling for the bill, and now you also have the unions calling for the bill as well. So you have this sort of united front, um, asking uh, for Congress to um, enable the Surface Transportation Board to look at that definition of what is reasonable rail service under the common carrier obligation. And then you also had the former House, the chair of the House TNI, Transportation and Infrastructure Committee, Peter DeFazio, uh, hold a hearing about that as well. I remember he had invited STB chairman Marty Oberman to speak at one of the hearings and was asking, well, why can't you guys, do more in terms of helping to fix rail service? And then, as Oberman said, well, our hands are kind of tied in terms of like what we can do. That's sort of beyond our
Hmm.
pay grade.
Hmm.
Um,
Hmm.
so, so yeah, I think what's different this time around is that even though the rail service issues were a big issue in 2022, it seems, for better or for worse, that the February 2023 derailment of the NS train, brought a spotlight on the rail industry in a way that it
Hmm.
hadn't experienced before. I mean, it did experience it to some extent with the the potential work stoppages uh,
Hmm.
that some of the rail unions were threatening last fall. But I think I guess that those potential work stoppages, plus the uh, the heightened scrutiny that the rail industry has received, following the February 23 derailment, has kind of um, it'll be interesting to see like whether those events have sort of um, pushed Congress to to uh, I don't say more seriously consider the safety bill. But I mean the safety the Tammy
Hmm.
Baldwin's bill, but uh, you know whether it will be more momentum for something to happen, because I think both the rail service bill and the rail safety um, bill, and also the other movement that has been going on. I mean, I think for both of those issues, even though one's operations and one's safety, I think some have argued that the root cause of both situations is precision scheduled railroading, or at least
Hmm.
um, the railroads cutting their workforce numbers
Hmm.
you know prior to the pandemic, and then and a lot more during the pandemic, and then of course now they're trying to recoup those numbers somewhat, but since PSR has um, been kind of seen as the root cause, will the rail service bill move further in the Senate, or in committee? I don't know. We'll see.
Yeah, definitely something to watch. I mean, it seems like things are happening there, at least just with so much attention on both service and safety. I've got about 2 minutes left. Maybe we'll just talk a little bit about one of the big suppliers that you wrote about, Greenbrier companies. They have a little bit of a different fiscal, year. You wrote an article about this. I know earlier they had talked about, not having enough people. Did they say anything about that improving at all?
Ooh, be honest, I don't remember off the top of my head.
Okay.
I think I don't want to say the wrong thing. I mean, if it was said, it's probably improving. If it
Mhm.
has improved, then it's not a big issue. But I don't really, um, I don't totally remember what they said during it. But I think in general, the those issues of hiring and retention
Mhm.
have improved, and it's just kind of an um, uh, ongoing effort to get
Mhm.
numbers and workforce, sort of manpower to where it needs to be. Um,
Okay.
but it was interesting that how Greenbrier reiterated, that even though you have these market uncertainties, that there's still the pent up demand, and there's still demand for rail cars, because of the pending retirements that are happening among various fleets like the
Mhm.
box cars and whatnot. So um, there there didn't seem to be like a big concern that that car orders are going to fall off a cliff or something. I mean, there might be some
Mhm.
adjustments, but it's not anything catastrophic. if anything.
Yeah, certainly Wall Street, like what they had to say. I want to bring up a stock chart on that quickly. Basically, stock went from $32 to $44 that day. I think it was the best performing stock. That day it's come back a little bit to 41, but this was one when I followed this when I was a stock analyst. It was always one that got a lot of attention from the hedge funds because you can see when they report earnings like they did at the left part of that chart in November, how that shot way up. And then in January went way down, lots of volatility that the hedge funds tried to take advantage of. But I think what moved the stock in that particular case is they said that they had new rail car orders for 4,600 units during the quarter and then another 7,900 units after the quarter. And that's on versus deliveries of 6,600 units. So you do have a strong book to bill there. So most of the things are going well. Like you said, strong demand for orders. They said for everything except intermodal units, intermodal rail cars, which you would not expect there to be much demand for given what volumes have done. So with that, I think it's all the time we have. Thanks for joining me, Joanna, and thanks everyone for listening.